8. And probably many of you look familiar, so you've been attending some of these. To the new people, we have a whole lecture series outline on the table back there, as well as up on our website. And just a reminder, if you're not aware of this, the themes that we have chosen were selected by students as being the issues of greatest interest to them. And as we've learned so far, greatest interest to us too, and boy, what we didn't know. So this is, the whole point in this, of course, is to be as informed as you can as a voter. And any of you who would like to register, we have that capability at the back and also on our website. And remember, every vote counts. So important to follow through all of these. This is a really interesting election season. Now, we had our party last week, so we won't announce that anymore. Those of you who didn't come didn't get the red, white, and blue cake. It was really fun. That was the opening of the art exhibit. And quite a few students registered that day as well, so that was good. So, without further ado, because people find this time very short, I'd like to introduce to you today Carolyn Christian and Laura Watt. Again, the Department of Environmental Studies and Planning, they rule. So the issue today is the environment, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. So I was really delighted when Karen invited us to speak on this topic because, as you know, issues pertaining to the environment haven't gotten a lot of press or play in this year's election cycle, apart from climate change and energy-related issues. And so, obviously this is a really big topic. So what we want to do is just provide the context for some of the key environmental issues and then hopefully point you in some directions where you can get some more information on the candidates and what their policies are, and then maybe some background on how to evaluate these different policies. Okay. We almost have contact here.
Little countdown.
Pressure's on.
I like the little staticky thing they used to have. Brought to you right now.
Okay. But before I go on, I want to just make the point that really what we're talking about here is a bigger issue about science and how science is addressed in policy and how it's being addressed in this presidential election and how the next president will address it. And I'd like to argue that science will play a critical role in addressing many of our most urgent problems facing our country and the world today. Problems pertaining to human health and medicine, global disease, stem cell research are a couple that come to mind. And this is a really big issue, science and technology policy. Will our next administration embrace or find the linkages between scientific innovation and economic growth? That's obviously a really big topic right now. And of course, the environment. Will our next administration use science to help solve and guide environmental issues? And so this issue of the environment that we're talking about today, I really see that as a subset of this larger discussion or debate about what kind of role science should be playing in the election and beyond. Okay, but before I go on, I need to provide some context, and I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of our current administration as a way of sort of setting the stage for describing where we are today. And I don't want this to become a partisan discussion, but I'm not going to mince words when I talk about how certain actions and policies over the last 8 years have led us to where we are today with some of our environmental issues. So in some ways, it's a bit inescapable. But we hear a lot about the war on terror, but we've also been facing 8 years of a war on science in this administration. An administration that denies science, often suppresses science, or even goes to the extent of distorting scientific information. And that's been very well documented. And as a result, we're witnessing the legacy of what we're going to refer to as deferred maintenance. There are a lot of environmental problems out there that just haven't gotten much attention. due to inaction. And so as a result, many of our environmental problems have greatly deepened. So the big question, of course, that we're all here to look at is how will our next president respond to some of these issues? So, the big question is, will our next president embrace or continue to undermine science in the environment? And this is a really hard question to evaluate, as I said earlier, because environmental issues are rarely discussed or seen in presidential debates, and I can guarantee you that we won't hear much about many of the environmental issues I'm going to talk about today, or that we're going to talk about today in the next 3 debates. And my colleague here, Laura Watt, is going to talk about why that is, why we have a hard time reconciling environmental issues with really important concerns like the economy, and why economic concerns often trump in the environment. But I also just want to say that I, along with many other people, feel that the economy, our economy, and the strength of our economy will depend on how we address these issues in the environment. And like I said, I'm not the only one with this sort of viewpoint. In fact, a citizens initiative was launched about a year ago, and has since been co-authored by some prominent scientific organizations like the AAAS, the Institute of Medicine, the NAS, and over 175 universities and scientific organizations have signed on to this initiative. And the basic idea was this: wouldn't it be great if we could have a presidential debate that focused on science issues, including issues pertaining to the environment? I think people quickly realized
Lang, please come to the circulation.
that wasn't going to happen. But I want to urge you or encourage you to go to this website, Science Debate 2008, and what they did is they posed 14 top science questions. Now, not all of these are directly related to what we would call the environment. Some are health related. And they show side by side what the two candidates' positions are on these key issues. So here's one really important source. And this organization identified the following environmental issues as some of the top environmental issues of our time. And so obviously climate change is high on the list, conservation and species loss, ocean health or the future of our oceans, issues related to fresh water, population growth, and renewable energy research. And obviously, we could spend an hour on each one of these topics, and fortunately, we had an hour last week to at least address one of these topics. But in the interest of time, today I'm going to focus on climate change, conservation, and oceans. Now, climate change is inarguably one of the most important issues facing us today, and unfortunately, we are coming off of 8 years of an administration that has worked to undermine this issue, and by, as I said before, suppressing science, by first of all denying the science and then suppressing it. And here's a really interesting example. The New York Times came out with a spread back in 2005 showing how someone in the Bush administration played a really big role in heavily editing a document called the Strategic Plan for U.S. Climate Change Science Program. And you can just sort of see the struggle that was going on here in these handwritten notes. At first, certain words like will were softened to would, and then this editor decided, well, let's just cross out the whole thing, because what this is straying from research strategy into speculative findings and musings here. And then in the draft that actually made it out to the public, this whole paragraph that was talking about, you can't read it obviously, but was basically trying to outline some scenarios for what climate change might look like for our country. It was reduced to warming could also lead to changes in the water cycle in polar regions. And then by the time the final report came out, the whole paragraph was nixed. And you can go through this whole report and just see example after example. So that's just an example of the culture surrounding science and how it's been treated. But at least one debate we can say is, I'd say, mostly over. There are still people who would like to debate the idea that climate change is widely accepted as a reality. And more importantly, that the link between anthropogenic greenhouse gases and climate change has been well established. And this has been rigorously addressed in the most recent report from the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was released last fall, or there were 4 documents released over the course of last year. This is a document that's backed by hundreds of scientists, and this document, or series of documents, has had the strongest language yet about warning about the potential consequences of climate change. And this was a big change for this body, because in previous reports, some of their language was pretty tepid. So with this context, with the weight of evidence behind this issue and the world scientists behind this issue, the big question is, how swiftly now are we going to act? Can we act? And the IPCC report outlines some pretty dire consequences if we don't act quickly. And here's a graph from one of the reports showing the change in temperature above pre-industrial global average temperatures, so starting from 0 and up to where we are today, up to about a 1 degree centigrade increase, and then what different scenarios might look like depending on the policies that we implement and how we act in response to this growing problem. And like I said, I urge you to read some of these reports. They outline what the world might look like if we see an increase of 4 degrees centigrade on average, or even what it might look like with a 2-degree increase. And so all of these are fairly dire predictions, all the way going to major extinctions around the globe, corals extinct, reefs overgrown by algae, major loss of Amazon rainforest and its biodiversity, etc. Now I'm focusing on more of the biodiversity-related aspects of this, but the report there's also a whole report dedicated towards how our human society will also be affected. So the next issue, conservation and species loss, there are a couple of key issues here that I want to bring up. And the one we hear about the most right now is the future of our public lands, in particular mining and drilling. And the question is, should we allow drilling for oil or mining in places like the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR? This has been protected up to this point, but will we continue to see this amazing wilderness continue to be protected as it has been in the past? And there's also the issue of support for conservation of new lands. If you think about it, many of the habitats in the United States and species in the United States are very underrepresented in terms of what we've conserved. There's a real bias towards preserving mountainous areas, what I call rocks and ice, and there are a lot of habitats that just have no representation. And so how much will our next president embrace this idea and be a more encompassing of biodiversity protection? But I think most importantly, the Endangered Species Act is on the chopping block and has been for the last 8 years. And this represents one of our most important and strongest pieces of environmental legislation. And this tool has allowed us to protect vast numbers of species and their habitats. And without this legislation, or with it greatly weakened, the question is how effective can we be in protecting species and habitats? Just to give you an idea about what the last 8 years have looked like, here's a graph showing the rate of listing of species, so whether they're endangered or threatened, by each administration since the Endangered Species Act was passed in the early 70s. And you can see over time, starting with Ford and going up through Clinton, the number of species listed per year steadily increased. And we went from about 62 species per year being listed on average under Clinton to 8 per year listed under George W. Bush. So that's a big change. And we can see that type of assault on the Endangered Species Act and many other measures of activity with this act. And not just species listed, but the number of recovery plans that have been released. Recovery plans, it's been clearly documented that recovery plans play a really important role in the success of an endangered species recovery. And this is a more insidious thing that's happened, but the amount of critical habitat designated for many endangered species has been drastically reduced for a variety of endangered species. There's also been a great deal of political interference with scientific determinations, and there was a survey done by PEER, which is an organization called Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, and the Citizens Union of Concerned Scientists. No, is that it? Yeah, one of those two organizations. Anyway, they did this survey of employees in the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, the two entities that are responsible for implementing the Endangered Species Act. And over 50% of them said that politics had interfered with their ability to use science to make important determinations about the protection of endangered species. So there's that. There have been several attempts to gut the act, and I was shocked to see that as recently as August 2008, and we were talking a little bit about this before we started with Barbara, but there have been so many key issues on the table every day. We're just being barraged with issues, and many of them are just kind of slipping under the radar, and I think this is one of them. But before the current administration leaves, they have a desire to change the act so that federal agencies can decide on their own if projects are causing any harm. And currently that's not the case. And so this raises the question, is this really the fox guarding the hen house here? But the other really important change that's being proposed is that decisions for listing a species be based only on direct impacts of activities. So if you think about it, something like climate change is really an indirect effect. So the loss, so think of the polar bear, the loss of the ice pack is really an indirect effect on the polar bear. And so it's not like something like going out and bulldozing over some important flower habitat or some important animal's habitat. It's an indirect effect. And so this administration would like those indirect effects to be excluded. Okay. Boy, this is really uplifting, isn't it? I was just like, okay, what's next here? The future of the oceans. This is probably the most tragic thing on my list here, and many people don't realize that our oceans are in free fall. And this might sound like a bit of hyperbole, but they're really in bad shape, and all around there are many bad things happening in the oceans. And if we just continue to pretend like it's business as usual in the ocean, we're going to see some major changes. So fishery collapse, we hear about that all the time, but there's weird things happen, like these big anoxic zones occurring, say in the Gulf of Mexico, algal blooms, coral bleaching. The oceans are becoming increasingly more acidic as they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. This concept of functional extinctions, when you remove enough of something like a top predator, like a shark, down to such low numbers that that ecological niche, if you will, becomes a functionally extinct. So anyway, there's a lot of issues here, and there have been a series of very high-profile papers that have come out over the past 5 years in journals like Nature and Science demonstrating these impacts to the ocean. And here's just an example. I know you probably can't read the legends on here, but on the x-axis is time, and then on the y-axis is catch per 100 hooks. So it's a measure of how much fishermen are catching. And this is for different regions in the ocean, in oceanic systems and shelf ecosystems. And you can see the same pattern of decline in each one. So this is not only an ecological catastrophe, but an economic one as well. So candidates' positions on environmental policy. I can't cover all of that right now, but I really encourage you to just dig a little deeper into it, and there is some information out there. it's very instructive to look at the candidates' web pages. That was the first thing I did when Karen asked us to do this. I said, well, what are they saying? And I found that McCain had very detailed policy papers on energy and climate change, but no other environmental issues were addressed in his policy paper. So he doesn't specifically have a policy paper on the environment. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't have policy on the environment. It's just not being presented on his webpage, the most accessible portal for his information. Obama, on the other hand, has a very detailed policy paper on the environment, and it's very long. And it addresses things like wetlands loss and what to do with species invasions in the Great Lakes, and an incredible amount of detail. So I urge you to look at those two websites. And again, like I said earlier, the Science Debate 2008 website, you can see their responses to these 14 science questions. And of course, there's a question about climate change. And you probably some of you may already know this, but Obama and McCain have remarkably similar policies regarding climate change. And in fact, McCain, more than any of the other presidential candidates during the primary, had the most progressive and aggressive policy on climate change. But there are several differences in, say, the types of incentives or how it might be implemented, and how science innovation might play a role in solving this problem. So that's a really interesting point. I think that oftentimes, the media is just so desperately trying to polarize the situation, and I think Laura's going to speak to that issue. But if you really start looking, you'll see that there is a lot of common ground here. Of course, past records. Again, I don't have the expertise to dive into that, but that, of course, is a ripe area to look for. If one candidate claims something but they're voting a different way, that's informative. And more, I said I was going to keep this nonpartisan. But I really think that looking at the choice in running mates is important. And I just said, McCain, for a representative of the Republican Party, has come forward with some pretty progressive ideas about the environment, but his choice in running mate is quite startling in a way, because she represents so many opposite positions regarding issues around the environment, the role of science, the Endangered Species Act. And so I don't know how that campaign is reconciling that huge difference between them. So with that, like I said, I encourage you to look at this website. I'm going to hand this over to Laura Watt now, and maybe she can help us dissect, why we have such a hard time talking about the environment and environmental issues in these presidential elections.
I am talking about contrast of candidates here. Low tech, high tech. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm sorry. You just get me. And can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. A little bit higher. I can be loud. It's easier because I tend to gesticulate a lot, and I think I'll knock that thing off of my outfit if I have to wear it. So Caroline, thank you for. She's been discussing, as you know, some of these sort of most pressing scientific challenges and environmental challenges that we're facing in this world today, and they are depressing. It's not a cheerful job to be in right now. When I was an undergrad, I thought it was going to all be happy animals and plants jumping, and no, I didn't know I was going to a grim line of work. But not only just the what challenges we have, but also this importance of taking science seriously and really using data to try and come up with solutions. And I'd like to step back a little bit from this. My expertise is more as a social scientist rather than a natural scientist. And so I'm interested in asking a broader question, which is more sort of this question of why do environmental issues tend to become so polarizing? It is interesting that McCain and Obama have such similar platforms on climate change, but that seems rare, right? We tend to think of of Democrats and Republicans being on opposite ends of spectrums when it comes to most environmental issues. And I think what's interesting about this, sort of trying to tackle that issue, isn't just to say, well, it's because they're a Democrat or Republican, don't want to pigeonhole too much, but really to dig into sort of some of the underlying philosophical or political sort of worldviews or outlooks, which do vary significantly across the liberal conservative spectrum, but also sometimes don't just line up neatly with that spectrum. Sometimes they're running across currents. And trying to understand what are some of the reasons why people react to environmental issues in ways that sometimes we don't expect. We look at those charts of, fisheries depletions around the world, and many of us who are really trained in science start, sort of catch our breath and feel very frightened. Others look at those charts and react in a different way, and we don't really understand why that is. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Maybe I should stand here in the middle so people on the side can see me. There we go. Sorry about that. So I just made a list for myself of some of these sort of variations, some of the reasons why people react differently to environmental issues. Some of it, I don't know how many of you were here for Sasha's talk last week, but she was comparing the oil addiction to real addictions and using a lot of psychological patterns for understanding why we're still hooked on oil, and I think that was very insightful. So I'm going to do something kind of similar. One of the first variations, I think, in terms of people's sort of real philosophical outlook of how they just understand the world works is a distinction between sort of trusting public decisions versus private decisions, trusting the government to solve problems versus trusting the marketplace to solve problems. This is a really fundamental split, and of course we're seeing that a lot in the debates going on right now, not even about environmental issues, but about the bailout. Do we have government rush in and try and solve financial crisis right now, or do we wait and let the market sort of solve itself? There's very, very fierce and very distinct opinions about that, and people get very riled up. And with a lot of environmental issues, that becomes an important distinction because we're trying to decide, should government step in and protect species, or should species sort of be out there and be protected through private activity, through people's actions, and gosh, if a species is in the way, well, maybe that's just too bad, or maybe relying on private institutions like land trusts or other kinds of organizations to do the kind of protective work that we often associate with the government. So that's one of these sort of variations, government versus marketplaces. Another is even just within what kinds of actions government can take. Do you prefer a direct government action? Back at the turn of the century, turn of the last century, 1900, we were looking at, particularly in the East Coast, a lot of concern about forests and overcutting by the timber industry and resulting floods and fires that would come from overcut lands. And the solution was, let's have a government agency that will manage forestry. Not all of it. We still have privately managed forests as well. But it was the solution was a direct government action. Government will take some control, in the case of the eastern lands, of privately owned cut over lands. In the case of the west, lands that were forests that were already on public land. And we'll manage those resources so that we'll have a steady supply of timber for forever, basically. So the idea was government should just step in and do it itself. I always call this in my policy class direct government action. Or direct government service. What we also could do to solve the same kind of problem is we could pass a regulation, some kind of a punitive, punish those polluters, punish those bad timber harvesters, in my timber example, let them keep their lands, but impose strict fines on them if they don't go about timber production in a particular kind of way. That's another response that government could have. A third response is we could provide incentives. We could say, hey, here's a little carrot. We'll give you some extra money or some more land or whatever it is that we think those companies might want, a better tax deal. We'll cut you, change your tax rate if you behave the way we want you to. Government has these options, sort of three big categories of options, as to how it might want to influence private individuals or private corporations' behavior. And we have a lot of fundamental disagreement about which of those are the right being in quotes, the correct way to go, which will be most effective, which is sort of morally correct. Should government step in and provide health care for everyone, or should we rely on private health institutions to provide insurance and health care and so forth? There's a lot of really fundamental disagreement about what kind of government role should they step in and do. So that's my second on my list. The third, and this is one that gets away, I think, from the traditional liberal conservative sort of spectrum, is sort of a trust of trickle down, if you will, versus the grassroots, versus coming from the bottom. This has been coming out, again, not so much in environmental discussions, because there haven't been any lately, but in economic discussions. You hear, I was listening to one of Obama's speeches the other day. He was talking about we need to solve this economic crisis from the bottom up versus the top down, not worrying so much about Wall Street, but worrying more about individual mortgage holders and so forth. On the environmental level, I think that's an important distinction as well. Do we want to, should problems be solved locally? Should they be solved nationally? Should they be solved by small groups who are getting in there on the ground and doing their own thing? Or do we need a big national centralized policy and start at sort of that level and then figure out how to do the on-the-ground stuff afterwards? That's another one of these kinds of distinctions, and it isn't necessarily one that's easily pegged into a political camp. I think you can find people on both ends of the political spectrum who have more of a faith in grassroots organizations and grassroots kinds of activity, and others who will have more of a faith in sort of centralized, organized, top-down kind of approach. So that's an important distinction as well. My fourth of these sort of variations is having a trust or a comfort with status quo, with not changing, and saying we've always done it this way. This is the traditional way of doing things. This is the right way of doing things. Versus someone who's very comfortable with change, with innovation. We, of course, have heard change an enormous amount in this election and never-ending election cycle. You know, what do people really mean when they're talking about change? You need to have a certain kind of comfort, I think as Caroline was saying, with the concept of innovation and what innovation can do for the environment, for the economy. Sometimes that faith in innovation is sometimes look a little blind. You know, a lot of the people who back in the 60s when Paul Ehrlich was writing a lot about population growth, and a lot of economists, their argument saying population, we don't have to worry about population because we're going to come up with technologies that, you know, feed the world and will solve all those problems, and innovation is going to solve all of our environmental problems, not in the way maybe that we're thinking of in context of Caroline's talk, but the opposite. So that reliance on or faith in innovation to solve our problems, to really come up with solutions versus, I think as Sasha and Jeff both were talking about last week, cutting back, changing fundamentally the way we do things, or then people who are comfortable with the status quo and say we just need to stick with the way we've been doing it and maybe change a few little things around the margins, but generally not have to change our economic way of life, our political way of life, etc. I think the stuff going on with the financial markets and the bailout really do raise a very fascinating question about whether our economic system will be able to continue the way it has with sort of a status quo approach, or whether it will have to change. And there's a lot of discomfort with, oh, we're going to have a new economic system? What's that going to look like? So whether or not you're comfortable with taking on that kind of a change is a big variation. Let's see, fifth on my list is what I first wrote down as sort of luxuries versus necessities. What's our personal attitude toward different aspects of the environment, and do we look at protection or interest in that environment as something that we need, something that we rely on, something that we can't live without, something that is sort of a luxury, something that's an add-on. Well, it's really nice to have that, but maybe we don't need it. I think you see this sometimes in some of the species arguments. People say, well, you know, polar bears are really nice. They work really well on calendars. They're really pretty. But, you know, does it matter if we only have 100 of them and they live in zoos? Or, you know, do we need them running around out there on the ice cap? What are they really doing for us? You know, I don't see them working very hard. This sort of getting down to valuing the environment for its use value, for its utilitarian value, versus valuing it for its existence value. Saying that I just like knowing that there are polar bears roaming around there. I'll probably never see one. They have no influence on my life. I was not planning on eating any of those seals myself. But I still think it's a good thing that they're out there doing their polar thing. Which environmental issues the next administration may end up focusing on is going to have a lot to do, I think, with that perceived utilitarian value. I think we will see a lot of discussion, regardless of who the next president is, of issues around climate change, issues around energy use, and what kinds of energy things we need to go forward with. We may see a real decrease in funding for parks, because parks tend to be sort of perceived as something that is a luxury. They're really nice to have, but we can survive without them. Or being worried about them is sort of, you tend to worry about conservation of parks after you already have enough money in your pocket to buy lunch and pay your rent. When you're facing real serious economic concerns yourself, you don't get as worried about, are we spending enough money to buy up new habitat? So again, the perception of the environment as something that's important for use versus something that's kind of a luxury, maybe a little extraneous, maybe not so important to me. There's a real divergence in how people approach them. And finally, last on my list is getting back to, I think, where we started. Whether people have a fundamental faith in science or trust in science, in the scientific method itself, or whether they are skeptical of that. And I think, you know, those of us who are in a university setting find it very hard to believe sometimes that there are people who don't trust science. It seems so trustable and rational, and you know, it's been around for a while and seems to produce some really good results. But there are you know, sort of philosophical approaches that are very skeptical of science. They tend to say, well, you know, but did you really consider this? And I prefer to believe that. You know, I was listening to one of the candidates being interviewed this morning on radio, and just was being asked, what was it? I can't remember. Can't remember what the original question was, but was essentially sort of some question about science, and the response was, well, we just have a fundamental disagreement about that. And I was like, but that's a factual question. It's a fact. Facts aren't usually things that we debate about, but he had a very different approach. Actually, it was George McCain. Good Lord. Major Freudian slip there. I'm sorry. John is his name. John McCain. And one of the things, how many of you watched the debate, was it last week? The time is going by, isn't it? Yeah. The next one's tomorrow. Don't forget to watch that. But, you know, one of the things that always strikes me in McCain's speeches, he keeps using this one example when he's griping about earmarks, you know, one of his real sort of signature things. He always brings up this one example of a ridiculous expense of government money, which is this bear DNA study. And he says, you know, he makes the joke about, I don't know if it was a paternity suit or a criminal suit. You know, everybody laughs, and that's kind of cute. You know, it was actually, however many $3 million, a study to try and determine whether grizzly bears living in the lower 48 are actually a distinct species or subspecies, I'm not sure which, from those who live up in Canada and Alaska. Very important for Endangered Species Act implementation and concern about species, yet he's kind of there making fun of a scientific project because he thinks it's a frivolous, expensive money. So that's where, again, this sort of, do you trust science? Do you feel like science is giving you information that is useful and important, and they're facts that you aren't going to sort of argue with, or are you take more of a skeptical approach and consider, well, there are other ways of finding out information other than the scientific method, some of which are very important and some of which often get overlooked in the move towards science. So generally speaking, to sort of wrap this up, and then we wanted to leave a bunch of time to have discussion with you guys, answer questions or get into a more of a discussion. I think one of the problems with all of these sort of variations of people's philosophical and political outlook is that, generally speaking, a lot of the big environmental issues that we're worried about today are very long-term, very large scale, and they often require us to take a very different approach to how we've been living our lives. We may not be able to continue the same kind of lifestyle that we have. We may need to get out of that little Subaru that I drive every day to work and get onto the bicycle. Of course, I live 30 miles away, so that would be a little tricky, but anyway. And dealing with large-scale, long-term, complex issues doesn't always work very well with either a market approach or with a democratic government approach. Sometimes neither of those is very good at solving that problem. When we rely on collective action, everybody say, yes, if you want to protect the polar bears, and then trying to figure out how to implement that. So, like I said, these spectrums don't necessarily line up along neat little party lines. And part of why you don't tend to hear the candidates talking about a lot of these issues in their debates is because they can be very dangerous pre-election. Essentially, if you show your hand as being on one side of one of these spectrums and not the other, you will run the risk of alienating people who have the other view. And they're not necessarily the people that I know they're not going to vote for me anyway. So, because there are so many sort of cross-cutting kinds of concerns. So I think in making your own electoral choices as you face this last month, can you believe it? It's only a month away now, till the election, is asking both sort of what are my own philosophical underpinnings? What are my beliefs and my preferences? Because sometimes we don't ask ourselves, and we don't actually articulate that to ourselves in a fundamental way. And how do those match up with the candidates' kinds of approaches? And then the second question that I would ask is how do those different kinds of approaches match well with our most pressing environmental problems? What do we need in a candidate? Whether or not they agree with me and my insight, how do they fit with the environmental issues that we're worried about? And really to come up with solutions. Because you may end up with somebody who just philosophically and fundamentally is just not quite wired in a way to address a problem in a particular way. So with that, I think we'd like to just open up to questions or comments. You want to stand? You want to sit?
I'm going to sit right here.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make the point that in the presidential debate last week, Obama did make like 3 or 4 talking points about the environment, and I was actually surprised because I was going in thinking that they weren't going to address it at all. So I just wanted to kind of point out that even pre-election, I think there is kind of a dialogue in the debates.
Do you remember what you mentioned? Excuse me, I can't remember myself.
No, I don't. I mean, I didn't write it down or anything, but I just remember distinctly, like, I think at least 2 or 3 times that there were at least, talking points made about the environment, and he was, trying to change the topic even at some points.
Yeah, he's injecting it in even though it's not being asked.
Exactly. That's very encouraging. My biggest worry, I was joking with Caroline yesterday, that, with all the financial troubles, we can just take our discussions of the environment and throw them out the window because it's not going to be top priority. But I'm not sure that's actually true because of the point that Caroline made that so many of our environmental problems are now more and more and more inextricably connected to our economic problems. So I think that's going to be an important thing to recognize, and hopefully, as some of the additional questions coming up in the debates, we'll ask that. We'll say, how do you deal with these connections between the economy and the environment, rather than seeing them as totally separate realms?
I think that polls drive their positions quite a bit, and I was wondering if you think there's a chance that their similarity on the environmental issue means that there's somewhat of a consensus amongst the American citizens.
Well, yeah, it may be no accident that, well, I mean, like I said, I pointed out that the candidates in the primary for the Republican Party differed tremendously, whereas the candidates in the Democratic primary didn't. So, yeah, whether the nomination of John McCain reflects, I mean, I don't think he was nominated because of his policy on climate change.
Can you guys speak out?
Sure, sorry. I was just saying that there was a real contrast among the vice president or the presidential candidates for the Republican Party in their platforms, environmental platforms, or the platform for climate change, but that wasn't the case for the Democrats so much. And so I was saying I don't think that John McCain was nominated because solely because of his his ideas about climate change. So I don't know how much of this convergence reflects this bottom-up approach that you're talking about.
But he's crafted his position papers since he became a candidate. So.
But his ideas he was articulating well before those were even early on in the primary season.
I think one of the concerns that I have about McCain is the ways in which he has held, and if you go back and, like you recommended, go back and look at his record, he actually has a pretty good environmental record as a senator, and he's been one for quite a while, so that's a pretty hefty record to go back and look at. The concern that I have myself, not necessarily speaking as the professional professor here, but as just my own self, is seeing how he has changed on a number of other issues from what he was saying as a candidate for the primary versus what he's saying now. And that makes me wonder, is he also changing some of his views on climate change, or would he change his views on climate change in order to try and track with polls or so forth? Or would he really change that if he became president? It seems like an unknown to me at this point.
Can I just ask you guys to click on the mic?
Sure. Absolutely.
It gets a little dead.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. Thanks.
I don't know if mine's on.
So I think 2 of the 3 problems that you identified are really international problems. They couldn't be solved. I mean, we could be angels environmentally in the United States, but it wouldn't
Thank you.
really be more than a drop in a bucket in a way.
Yeah.
Because they're all. So what can you address that angle? How you see this election opening up somehow a better discussion worldwide about these issues?
Well, I think it really underscores the importance of reaching out and being able to address, reaching out and participating in, the United States has a long track record of not participating in key and global environmental efforts, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity. We are a country that did not sign it, and like 150 or 160 countries signed it. The Kyoto Protocol. So there's a lot of there's a long history there, and so I think we're going to have to mend that. We're going to need a president who's going to be willing to say mea culpa, but we're ready now to participate in the international arena in solving these problems. So I guess the question is, which candidate do you feel is more apt to do that and more capable of doing that?
I think it's a combination with that, not just participation in those issues,
and leadership,
and providing leadership in those issues, but oh gosh, now I just completely forgot what I was going to say. Oh, I know what it was. Mending our reputation, as you will, not just coming in and saying, okay, we'd like to sit at the table now, but I think the last 8 years in particular have really eroded a lot of our credibility in the world in terms of following up what we say we're going to do with what we're actually going to do, taking our own stated political approaches to whatever, the economy, to war situations and so forth, to actually to walk our walk and to talk to match our walk with our talk. I think we've been not very good at that for a while, and so perhaps it may be we need a president who can accept not being the only superpower. That, I think, is going to be a hard pill for some politicians to swallow who are used to having that role, that the U.S. can pretty much dictate what we want around the world and other countries will fall in line, to be accepting that we're just going to be a participant in a group, as you say, an international group that's going to need to tackle some of these issues in a cooperative manner rather than being able to dictate those terms.
And that's going to be especially important because just because the United States hasn't signed on to these efforts in the past doesn't mean that these efforts haven't gone forward. So this is a case where the rest of the world is providing leadership on these issues, and I think we're going to have to tread very delicately as we try to reinsert ourselves into these processes. And It'll be, one of 150 or 160 players, and not the player dictating what happens.
One of my primary concerns, the points you bring up today, is sort of discourse as it's presented in science from the right. And you bring up this McCain sort of lambasting the idea that we would have $3 million to study bears, and cynically one could say, well, no, that's very political of him to do that, because what we want to do is not identify separate species. Therefore, the ESA cannot be invoked in protecting that subgroup or group of animals. But beyond that, there's this general discourse that sort of is discrediting facts, as you point out, discrediting intelligentsia, discrediting, and this isn't how the group brings it up to, because we are the ones being discredited. But I'm very concerned about that. I just wonder, how we can address that to the general public so they're not made out to look irrelevant, because we're telling them things they don't want to hear. What do you think?
Anyone else want to? That is very troubling, and we're being cornered, and
We're being marginalized.
yeah.
I was actually struck to not even make it a Republican-Democrat thing. I was struck when back in May, was that? April? When there was still sort of Clinton versus Obama, and McCain had proposed the gas tax holiday for the summer. And not to bash Hillary, I had great admiration for her, but she signed right on to that. And a lot of her language around that was, who cares what the economists say? We want this. It's good, yay. Even though every economist in the world was saying, stupid idea, stupid idea. So, pardon my bluntness there. That, it concerned me because it isn't just a which party do you belong to sort of alienation of intelligence and ideas and facts, that it seems to be a trend overall that is combating against science. And I think it is something really to worry about. I don't know what the solution is, other than scientists rising up, taking to the streets.
Well, I think as these problems deepen, especially with, say, the economic crisis, I think people are going to want to see talking heads out there who are really smart and who know what they're talking about. And I think we're going to see that. And
we need you guys to become those smart talking heads.
I think it'll be really interesting to see how the debate tomorrow plays out in that respect, and the next two. But I think people, when push comes to shove, they want somebody who's really going to be capable of handling the situation.
Well, we elected George Bush twice.
Yeah. Well, I hate to point it out, but he is part of the elite. That's the other thing, right? But
I would take it back actually to the point that Sasha made last week about sort of the 5 stages of dealing with a catastrophic new information, and one of them is denial. And I think this is a part of that. No, I just don't want to hear it. I know it's a fact, but I just don't want to talk about it. And hopefully it is a stage that we'll get through. It does worry me tremendously if it's a new trend as opposed to just a phase.
But isn't it part of the fault of science itself, because of all the specialization that you have? So you invite a physicist, a biologist, economists on television, but there's very few people that are able to explain that this is a whole system, that all these things are related. And so don't we need other types of scientists, or people that are very informed, that can break these broader pictures and be kind of talking heads for the connection between them?
Actually, I have a bit of a tendency to think that to some degree science hasn't paid enough attention to what the public thinks. This is perhaps going on a little bit of a limb, but all too often in our in a government agency trying to decide what to do, they'll go through all their scientific information, scientific facts. They'll ask for input from the public, and often the input from the public gets sort of marginalized or set aside and say, well, but the science says this, so this is really what we want to do. And in that case, you're following science against people's wishes, and that can be a very bad idea. Not to say that people should always win and that science should just be put on the side, but there needs to be a way of bridging those two, of better explaining scientific information to people, not setting it up necessarily as, again, an opposition between economic concerns and environmental concerns. I keep thinking of the spotted owl controversy in the Northwest, back in the 90s, when it really was sort of coming down to your job versus an owl that you've never seen before. Boy, how am I going to choose that? And the more that science, written with a big capital S, can not necessarily give in to public concerns in that, or sort of be subsumed by that, but to get into a dialogue, get into more of a dialogue, get into more of a compromise, to say, well, gosh, maybe we can't get everything that we want scientifically, but we can get some of it, we can get the most important pieces, and also be concerned about some of the arguments from the other side of the spectrum, if you will, from the people who are skeptical about science and who are more concerned with their own economic well-being than with an owl flying around in the woods that they're probably never going to see. So that, I think, taking those kinds of discussions more seriously may be an important part of getting around that vilification of the smart people.
I was going to ask, can you have countries like Russia and Canada kind of participate in a land grab in like the Arctic? You know, do you think that's going to hinder our efforts to fight against global change? You have people who are going to try to profit from it. Like, how do you fight against that?
Oh, and the U.S. isn't doing that. No, not at all.
So are you saying, well, what good is it if the United States shows leadership on an issue, but the rest of the world doesn't fall into place?
Well, no, but yeah, just like she said, like the United States, we have people who are profiting from bad things happening to the environment. Like, I mean, how do you fight against them? You have these powerful people that they're making money from it. Like, I mean, it's kind of depressing. Like the Arctic is melting. There are people who are really, I can make a buck off of this. Like, I mean,
I think it is, the best that I can say, it is to recognize that there are people who are going to think that, and to not say, you're ignoring science, or you're not doing the right thing. People have been exploiting the environment in various ways, forever, for profit. And so it should not be surprising that even when we're looking at something that seems as devastating and all-consuming as global climate change, that some people would say, hey, it's going to be warmer. That's great. I can suddenly be an agricultural zone in Siberia. Cool. To realize that will be their response, and therefore to begin that conversation, to say, I know that it's in your interests to let this happen, but maybe we can work out a way that we can help you with whatever it is that you wanted, and give you more economics, maybe support, so that you won't need to make that profit off of the glaciers melting. Does that make any sense? Yeah.
Well, I'd like to add that it's really important to have enough science in the conversation for people to understand the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, in that example, there's a fair chance that new lands opening up in the Arctic by things melting are not going to be good agricultural lands because of the soil chemistry. Or so maybe people aren't going to make the profit they think they're going to make. Or that in a setting where they were making marine protected reserves in the Caribbean, and there was tremendous fights with the fishing community, and they set off what science said needed to be set off, and 10 years later, those fishers are now the greatest proponents of protectants in the marine protected areas because their profits have actually increased. So it's really important for people not to take a little tiny soundbite of part of the science and think they know the picture and that's what they should base their judgment on.
Very, very good point. Very good point.
Well, a lot of these issues, that you raised, Hassan, this sort of response was a regulatory response, and so this will be these will be top-down decisions that are made that will influence whether somebody can partake in the land grab, as you describe, or go and overfish a certain area. But so, as more of these become top-down decisions by different governments, I think that's probably how it's playing out right now.
Yeah.
In the recent Olympics in China, that they tried to put on a good face about their concern about climate. Almost in a competitive edge, they can do it better than the rest of the world. If we can repair the environmental attitude in this nation in proportion to
have my crystal ball here today.
Well, it takes leadership.
Yeah.
That's what we want. We want leadership.
But it's also what Laura said. It's this cultural change. How do we get our society to embrace this culture of showing leadership and in solving these problems. And if another country that's as big and powerful of us is showing that leadership, will that then up the ante for our country? I don't know.
Well, I think you're already starting to see some aspects of that, not necessarily just with China, but I keep thinking about how every article that I hear on the radio or that I read about solar power always talks about Germany now. How Germany did this great thing where they've got solar panels on every farm and on every roof, and wow, they're cloudy and they're the solar leader. And so that I think can be very instigating and inspiring for other people to say, oh, hey, wow, if Germany can do it, heck, we can.
Well, yeah, one area where this is really getting traction, and this is a bit self-serving here with this audience, but this idea that the innovation is going to be coming from other countries because we have not been investing in our higher education, in K through 12, in STEM education. So I think that that's really going to be a critical issue, and I think people are starting to feel like this. Are we losing our competitive edge? That hopefully will inspire a reorientation of our priorities regarding education. Maybe I'm dreaming.
I think we've gone over. Should we
Yes.
stop? Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
And we'd be happy to answer any more questions if you have them.